Have you ever wondered what would happen if the most powerful man in the room were the one everyone underestimated? What if the person dismissed as insignificant was actually holding the fate of everyone else in his hands? What if a single glance, a silent exchange, or a folded piece of paper could expose secrets powerful people would do anything to hide? And what if one quiet moment was enough to bring an entire empire crashing down? Would you dare to keep listening if you knew the truth was about to change everything? The evening began with something no one noticed, and yet it was the very moment everything changed. The man stepped into the restaurant wearing a faded dark jacket, its edges softened by time. No one greeted him with recognition. In this place, worth was measured in fabric and posture, and he did not belong. The hostess glanced at him once, then looked past him, already deciding where he fit, or rather, where he did not. His name was Ethan Caldwell. But tonight, that name meant nothing. He had come without it. He accepted the smallest table near the kitchen, where the scent of oil and heat lingered in the air, where the rhythm of clattering dishes never stopped. It was not a mistake. It was a choice. He had not come to eat. He had come to observe. From that corner, he could see everything: the polished shoes, the effortless laughter, the practiced charm exchanged between people who had learned how to appear important. And then he saw her. She stepped out from behind the counter carrying a tray, her movements efficient but heavy with fatigue. Her shoulders were tense, her steps measured. Dark circles traced her eyes, yet there was something steady in the way she carried herself. When she looked at him, there was no judgment, no calculation, only a quiet awareness, as if she saw him as a person rather than a place on a seating chart. "Good evening," she said softly. Her voice was calm, controlled. "May I take your order?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "The least expensive item on the menu," he said. She did not flinch, no raised brow, no flicker of contempt. She simply nodded and wrote it down. Across the room, the manager noticed. A man with a practiced smile and cold eyes, he watched the exchange with thinly veiled irritation. His gaze lingered on the young woman longer than it should have. She felt it immediately. Her shoulders tensed, her movements sharpened. She had learned that look well. When she returned with a glass of water, her hand trembled just enough for him to see. Not from clumsiness, but from exhaustion, from pressure, from something pressing down on her day after day. He understood then. This was not about a bad shift or a difficult customer. This was about survival. As she set the glass down, her fingers brushed the edge of the table. For a fraction of a second, something slipped from her hand. A small folded piece of paper. She caught it quickly, too quickly, her eyes flicking up to meet his in silent alarm, their gazes locked. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them. He did not move. He did not react. He only watched. The moment passed. She stepped back, her expression composed once more, but the tension in her posture betrayed her. The manager's eyes followed her retreat like a shadow. Ethan sat still, his thoughts racing. He had come here expecting to confirm a theory about service and status. Instead, he had found something else entirely. A crack in the surface. A quiet signal sent by someone who had no other way to speak. The room buzzed around him, oblivious. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell. But to him, everything had narrowed to that single folded slip of paper and the woman who had risked everything to place it within his reach. He did not open it yet. He waited, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold settle over him like a storm cloud. Whatever was written on that small piece of paper, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night was no longer ordinary. The note burned against his skin long before he dared to read it. Ethan waited until the rhythm of the dining room swallowed him again. The hum of voices, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of wealth pretending not to notice itself. Only then did he unfold the paper beneath the table, shielding it with his palm, as though the words themselves might cry out if exposed too quickly. They were written in a hurried, uneven hand. "They are watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the office ledger. Trust no one." His chest tightened, not fear, recognition. This was not the scribble of a prank or a desperate plea for help. It was precise, intentional. A warning from someone who understood the weight of every word she had risked writing. He folded the paper again, slower this time, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. His expression did not change. To anyone watching, he was just another diner finishing a meal. But inside, the room had shifted. The air felt denser, sharper. Across the dining room, the manager's gaze lingered on him for a fraction of a second too long. Ethan lifted his glass, meeting that stare without challenge or fear, then looked away as if bored. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, the kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. He waited until the check arrived. The server returned, eyes lowered, hands steady in a way that betrayed effort. She placed the folder on the table and stepped back, her shoulders tense as if bracing for impact. He noticed the faint tremor in her breath. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, already retreating. When she turned away, her pace quickened, as if distance itself could protect her. Ethan paid in cash. Exact amount. No tip. It was deliberate. A message meant for only one person in the room. The manager noticed immediately. His jaw tightened. His gaze snapped toward the waitress, then back to Ethan, sharp with suspicion. Ethan rose, slow and unhurried, and slipped on his coat. As he moved toward the exit, he felt the weight of eyes following him, measuring him, trying to understand what he represented. To them, he was an anomaly, a variable that did not fit their system. Outside, the night air hit his face like a cleansing wave. He took a few steps away from the entrance before stopping beneath a flickering street lamp. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He unfolded the note again. The words stared back at him, darker now under the amber light. "They are watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger." His jaw tightened. The message was careful, not emotional, strategic. Whoever wrote it knew the risk, knew how to speak to someone who understood power and consequence. This was not desperation. This was a calculated reach for help. He thought of the woman's eyes, the controlled fear, the discipline it took to hand over that message without shaking apart. That was not the fear of a petty mistake. It was the fear of someone trapped. A slow breath filled his lungs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not his primary device, but the one he carried for moments like this. The one that did not ring unless something truly mattered. The call connected on the second ring. "I need a background sweep," he said quietly. Immediate, quiet, no digital footprint. A pause, then a familiar voice on the other end. Calm, professional, alert. On who? The restaurant, the management, especially the man running the floor tonight. "I want financials, personnel files, supply chains, everything." There was a brief silence, then a measured response. "Understood." How deep? Ethan looked back through the glass at the dining room, at the woman moving between tables, shoulders squared against a weight no one else could see. "As deep as it goes," he said, "and I want it clean." He ended the call and slipped the phone away. The night pressed in around him, heavy with the promise of consequences. Inside, the woman returned to her duties, unaware that the quiet man she had risked everything to warn had just set something irreversible in motion. The game had changed, and neither of them would ever walk out of that restaurant the same way again. The morning opened in silence, a heavy kind of silence that pressed against the air itself. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, spilling across the floor in pale streaks that felt cold rather than warm. Ethan stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the city as if it were a living thing beneath him. He had not slept, not because he was tired, but because his mind refused to rest. The small folded note still seemed to burn in his pocket, not its presence impossible to ignore. The words written on it replayed in his head, sharp and deliberate. They were not the words of panic. They were the words of someone who understood the risk and chose to speak anyway. He turned away from the window and reached for the secure phone locked inside his desk. The screen lit up as he activated it. This was not a device for casual calls. It existed for moments when truth had to be pulled from the shadows. "I need a full investigation," he said calmly when the line connected. "Everything connected to the restaurant. Ownership, finances, suppliers, internal operations. I want it all." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a measured voice replied, steady and precise. "Understood. How deep do you want me to go?" Ethan's gaze hardened. All the way down. No blind spots. The line went dead. He lowered the phone slowly, feeling the weight of what he had set in motion. Somewhere beneath layers of polished surfaces and polite smiles, something rotten was buried, and he intended to unearth it. Across the city, the young woman stood alone in a narrow changing room, her reflection fractured by the dull mirror. The fluorescent light overhead hummed faintly. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her uniform, fingers lingering on the worn fabric as if drawing strength from it. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Her thoughts raced back to the moment she had slipped the note onto the table. The risk, the fear, the brief flash of understanding in his eyes. That was the moment she knew she had chosen a path with no return. She pressed her palms against the sink, breathing slowly. She thought of the bills stacked on her kitchen table, of the hospital corridors she knew too well, of the nights spent calculating how long she could keep going. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, but beneath it burned something steadier. Resolve. In another part of the city, Marcus Hale stood alone in his office, the door shut tight behind him. He stared at the contents of his safe, the familiar documents suddenly feeling less reassuring than before. The numbers were still there, the signatures still clean, yet a cold unease crept into his bones. He could not shake the image of the man from the night before. Not the clothes or the posture, but the eyes, calm, measuring, as if they had already seen through him. His phone buzzed on the desk. He did not answer it. Miles away, Ethan scrolled through the first files that had begun to arrive. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable. Invoices that should not exist. Payments routed through shell accounts. A system built not on accident, but on intent. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The picture was coming into focus, and it was uglier than he had expected. This was not a mistake. It was a design. And the woman who had slipped him that note had stepped directly into the center of it. As Ethan closed the file, he felt the quiet certainty settle in his chest. This was no longer about curiosity or coincidence. It was about responsibility. The pieces were moving now. The game had begun. Night fell over the city like a heavy curtain, muffling everything beneath its weight. In his high-rise apartment, Ethan stood by the window, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the glass and casting long shadows across the room. The city moved below him, alive and restless, but his mind was fixed on a single thread that had begun to unravel far too easily. His phone vibrated once in his hand. "We've started digging," the voice on the other end said calmly. "The numbers don't align. The supplier listed in the records doesn't exist. The payments are being routed through multiple shell entities." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had expected as much, yet hearing it confirmed tightened something in his chest. This was no accounting mistake. This was architecture, deliberate, engineered. "Keep going," he replied. "Quietly, I want everything." The call ended. Silence returned, heavier than before. Across the city, in a narrow back room lit by flickering fluorescent lights, Lena sat on a metal bench, her elbows resting on her knees. The mirror in front of her reflected a face she barely recognized anymore. Pale, tired, older than it should have been. She pressed her palms together, trying to steady the tremor that refused to leave her hands. She thought about the moment she slipped the note onto the table, how her heart had pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it, how the man's eyes had met hers, not with suspicion, but with understanding. That single look had carried more weight than any promise. Now the fear was settling in, not sharp, but constant. A pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She knew she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. Relief. Because for the first time, she was no longer carrying the truth alone. In an office several floors above the dining room, Marcus Hale paced in tight circles. His jacket lay draped over a chair, his tie loosened. The familiar sense of control he usually carried had begun to slip. Something felt wrong. Too many coincidences. Too many unanswered glances. He opened the safe again, staring at the neatly stacked folders inside. Everything was still there. Everything was in order. And yet his instincts screamed that someone had begun to pull at the loose thread. He poured himself a drink, hands unsteady, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back at him looked older, more brittle. He did not like that. Miles away, Ethan stood in the dim light of his apartment, reviewing the first wave of data as it streamed across his screen. Transactions layered upon transactions, shell companies feeding into one another like veins under skin. It was all too clean, too deliberate. This was not greed. This was infrastructure. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The scope of it confirmed what he already knew. This was no isolated corruption. It was a system built to protect itself, and at the center of it all stood one frightened young woman who had dared to speak. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, then straightened. The path forward was clear now. There would be consequences for everyone involved. Outside, the city pulsed on, unaware that something fundamental had shifted beneath its surface. A quiet reckoning had begun. Morning arrived slowly, as if the city itself hesitated to wait. In the high-rise apartment, pale light crept across the floor,
I am ready.
stopping at the edge of the room where Ethan stood motionless. The city below moved on as usual, unaware that something irreversible had already begun. The screen on his desk still glowed. Lines of data streamed past in quiet order, each line revealing more than the last. What he was looking at was no longer speculation. It was structure, design, intent. The name appeared again and again. Marcus Hale. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. The deeper the data went, the clearer the pattern became. This was not a careless scheme or a desperate grab for money. It was an operation, layered, protected, built to last, and someone had been very careful to make sure it stayed hidden. His thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the young woman from the night before. The way her hands had trembled, the way her eyes had searched his, not for help exactly, but for recognition. She had known what she was risking. She had done it anyway. That kind of courage did not come from desperation alone. It came from being cornered with no way out. Across the city, in a narrow room behind the restaurant kitchen, she stood staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. The light overhead flickered, casting harsh shadows across her face. She barely recognized herself. The exhaustion was deeper now, heavier, pressing down on her chest. Every sound made her flinch. Footsteps in the hall, a door closing too hard, a voice raised just a little too sharply. She kept replaying the moment she had let the note slip from her hand, wondering if she had just signed her own sentence. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing slowly, trying to steady the storm inside. She told herself she had done the right thing. That silence would have destroyed her anyway. Elsewhere, Marcus Hale stood alone in his office, staring at the city through tinted glass. His reflection looked unfamiliar, strained. He had already made 3 calls that morning, each more tense than the last. Something was shifting beneath he could feel it. The numbers on his screen no longer felt like protection. They felt like exposure. He poured himself a drink, barely tasting it, his thoughts racing. He replayed every interaction from the previous night, searching for a mistake. The man at the table, the way he watched, the calm, the confidence. It was the calm of someone who already knew. A chill ran through him. Back in his apartment, Ethan closed the last file and leaned back in his chair. The picture was complete now. The scheme was wider than he had imagined, cleaner than he feared. It had been built slowly, patiently, with the kind of discipline that only long-term corruption could achieve. He looked at the city beyond the glass, its lights flickering like distant signals. Somewhere in that maze, a young woman was waiting, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. And somewhere else, a man was beginning to realize that his world was starting to crack. Ethan straightened, resolve settling in his chest. The line had been crossed. There was no turning back now. The pieces were moving, and the reckoning had begun. Night fell faster than expected, as if the city itself were holding its breath. From the high-rise window, Ethan watched the streets below glow with reflected light, each car passing like a brief pulse of life. He stood motionless, phone in hand, the silence around him thick and pressing. Something had shifted. He could feel it settling into place. The phone had stopped vibrating. No new messages, no updates, just quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives before impact. Across the city, Lena stepped out of the restaurant's back entrance, her shoulders tight, her steps careful. The cool air brushed her skin, but it did nothing to ease the tension coiled inside her chest. She could feel eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. Not yet. She kept walking, steady and controlled, every sense alert. When the door finally closed behind her, she exhaled sharply, but relief didn't come. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise inside. Somewhere behind her, something had shifted, and she knew it instinctively. High above the city, Ethan studied the information glowing across his screen. The patterns were no longer subtle. Funds redirected through layers of shell entities, transactions disguised as operational expenses, a carefully constructed web designed to look ordinary to anyone who wasn't searching for the truth. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. This wasn't corruption born of carelessness. This was precision, planning, control. A message flashed onto his screen. Movement detected, transfers accelerating. His jaw tightened. They knew. He reached for his phone and made the call without hesitation. "It's starting," he said quietly. "They're moving assets. We don't have time." On the other end, a calm voice replied, measured and alert. "Understood. We're activating the next phase." Ethan ended the call and stood still for a moment, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. The man looking back at him no longer resembled the observer who had walked into the restaurant days ago. Something had hardened. Focused. Okay. Elsewhere, Lena sat alone in her small apartment. The lights dimmed, the room filled with shadows. She sat at the edge of her bed, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. On the table lay a folded piece of paper, the same one she had risked everything to pass along. Her phone vibrated softly. A single message appeared. "You did the right thing." Her breath caught. For a moment she simply stared at the words, unable to move. Then slowly something inside her loosened. The fear was still there, but now it shared space with something else. Relief. Resolve. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware that beneath its surface a reckoning had already begun. The pieces were in motion, and there would be no turning back. Morning arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm. Sunlight spilled across the city, brushing the glass towers with pale gold as if nothing in the world had shifted overnight. Yet beneath that calm, something irreversible had already taken hold. Ethan stood inside the private elevator, his reflection staring back at him from the polished metal walls. His expression was composed, unreadable. The tailored suit he wore fit him like armor. This was no longer the man who had walked into a restaurant in worn clothes to observe from the shadows. This was the man stepping forward to end what should never have existed. The elevator doors opened. He stepped into the executive floor with steady purpose. The air felt heavier here, charged with anticipation. Conversations fell silent as he passed. Some faces registered recognition. Others flickered with unease. Everyone sensed it. Something final was about to happen. At the far end of the corridor, Marcus Hale stood alone outside the conference room, pretending to review documents on his tablet. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched. When he saw Ethan approaching, the color drained from his face. The mask he had worn for years cracked in a single instant. Inside the room, the atmosphere shifted the moment Ethan entered. The doors closed behind him with a muted thud that echoed louder than any raised voice. Screens along the wall flickered to life, displaying figures, charts, and transaction trails that told a story no one in the room could deny. Ethan did not raise his voice. "Let's begin," he said calmly. The data unfolded in silence. Transactions layered over one another. Shell companies linked by invisible threads. Accounts designed to vanish and reappear under new names. The illusion of legitimacy peeled away, revealing a structure built on deception. Marcus shifted in his seat. His breathing grew shallow. The confident executive had vanished, replaced by a man scrambling for footing. "This is a misunderstanding," he began, his voice tight. Ethan did not look at him. "No," he replied evenly. "This is a pattern." He nodded once. A security officer stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The room seemed to shrink as reality closed in around him. In another part of the city, Lena sat on the edge of her bed, her phone resting in her hands. When it vibrated, her breath caught. The message was short, simple, and impossible to misunderstand. "It's over." Her shoulders sagged as the weight she had carried for so long finally lifted. Tears welled, not from fear this time, but from release. She pressed her hand to her mouth, steadying herself as the truth settled in. Back in the conference room, Marcus was escorted out without ceremony. The door closed behind him, sealing the end of an era built on intimidation and silence. Ethan remained standing, looking out at the city beyond the glass walls. The storm had passed, but its echoes would linger. He knew the work was not finished. Systems like this did not fall in a single day, but this was a beginning. He turned away from the window and exhaled slowly. Somewhere across the city, a young woman was beginning to believe again in the possibility of safety, of dignity, of a future unburdened by fear. And for the first time in a long while, justice had found its way home. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the world a little differently, don't let it end here. Stories like this are more than entertainment. They remind us that courage often lives in quiet places and that one decision can change everything. If this journey kept you watching until the end, take a moment to let us know what part stayed with you the most. Your thoughts matter more than you think. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, support the channel by liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that truth and integrity still matter. And if you want to experience more powerful stories about hidden strength, moral courage, and the unseen battles people fight every day, make sure to subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. New stories are released regularly, each one crafted to move you, challenge you, and stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Stay with us and keep exploring the stories that remind us